Okay, so let's look at different types of infrastructures that we already mentioned. Of course, the first one is hard infrastructure, which is what always comes to mind. With hard infrastructure, we are mainly referring to human-made infrastructure such as roads, irrigation systems, and nuclear power stations. Of course, you can add many more things. Basically, hard infrastructure enables the production and distribution of clear fresh water, waste, energy products, people, and information. We have infrastructure to move people in cars, trains, on water, in the air, via rail and road, by foot, and so on, as well as bicycles. To facilitate the movement of people, we need energy which can be produced by various types of power generation plants or processing fossil fuels. This energy needs to be distributed through the electrical grid, and in the case of gasoline, through a combination of trucks and roads in order to be useful. So you begin to get what we mean by coupled infrastructure. Nothing is standing by itself. If you build a road, it is for something like vehicles. Then those vehicles have to be built and run on energy, and the energy has to be produced and distributed, and so on and so forth. So soft infrastructure, on the other hand, we refer to the human-made instruction for using other types of infrastructure. Instructions require knowledge of how systems work and thus involve significant investment as well. They are also absolutely essential to generate valuable outputs. So every time we talk about a system infrastructure, it has to have an outcome because it has a purpose for which it is built. Even when it is a natural infrastructure, we will see that they serve some purpose. The computer hard infrastructure on which this book was written is useless without the software, so that's the soft infrastructure. In this case, soft infrastructure can be thought of in general as the instructions by which society is run across all levels of organization, from the individuals to neighborhoods to countries to counties, nations, and the United Nations. One type of soft infrastructure essential to the topic of this book is that of institutions. Recall that institutions are rules, so instructions that structure repeated interactions between people. So we had action arena, action situation, actors, and repeated interactions for which rules are needed. Norms are also there implicitly. To be effective, these institutional arrangements must be combined with other types of infrastructure, such as all types of infrastructures necessary for organizations to function, such as buildings, communication, transportation, etc., which create, implement, and monitor the rules. Examples include the rules by which local governments function, the protocols by which crime labs and emergency services are run, the constitutional law upon which the Supreme Court bases its decisions, and the tax law by which the tax collector functions. Soft infrastructure enables societies to solve collective action problems and coordinate their activities. So that takes us back towards sustaining the commons, right? Natural infrastructure, on the other hand, is hard infrastructure that is not man-made but is still critical for society. Wetlands absorb and filtrate water, trees capture water and reduce erosion, and can store carbon, and bees pollinate flowers. Some people may use the term ecosystem services to refer to natural infrastructure, but those services only exist within an anthropomorphic context. So we are thinking it's there, so it must serve us, and then we say what's the value of the service, then do the cost-benefit analysis to say should this forest be protected, should this lake be protected, and so on. So there is an anthropomorphic concept as opposed to just an infrastructure that's functioning by itself, right? In our view, ecosystems are forms of infrastructure, and humans can limit or enhance the capacity and performance of those infrastructures through the use of other types of infrastructure. That is, services only flow in coupled infrastructure systems. Without knowledge of how to hunt or which plants are useful, human infrastructure is here below, etc., ecosystems do not produce services, right? Without knowledge of how to hunt or which plants are useful, etc., ecosystems do not produce services. Human infrastructure. Knowledge is an essential element of any productive society, whether it's the knowledge of how ecology works for the hunter-gatherer, knowledge of seed varieties and soil characteristics for an agriculturalist, knowledge of a 2D projection for the painter, knowledge of stone for the sculptor, knowledge of machinery for the industrialist, or knowledge of kinesiology for the athlete, how the joints connect and move, knowledge so all these things, knowledge is essential, indicators, examples. Knowledge is itself infrastructure based. Knowledge is itself infrastructure because it requires investment and can produce valued outputs when combined with other types of infrastructure. So there is fish in the ocean or in a lake or a river, then you need fishing gear and other ways to capture the fish, to cook it and eat it, or sushi. Right now you are investing in developing your human infrastructure. So you're learning this. I'm teaching this because I like it, but I also think it's important, and you are learning it because you may use it to get a job or so. These neural networks require great effort or investment to retain information and problem solving. In fact, the capacity of our brains to do this makes us uniquely human. This is something that is thrown in, but many species actually do what we do in terms of procreation, survival, and tool building, but let's assume we are the smartest ones. One might argue that we are also natural infrastructure. This is correct, but for analytical purposes it's useful to define this as a special case of natural infrastructure called human infrastructure. We also look at social infrastructure, which is a very critical part of repeated interactions. Social infrastructure refers to the relationships we have with others. These relationships, such as trust, are essential for our economy to function. So you buy and sell things, or you learn from me or somebody else, your parents teach you something. These are all kind of social infrastructures that we don't think about much. Imagine the number of times you need help from a friend or relative to get something done. What would you have done without friendship? Hire someone. Think of the trouble of hiring someone to do something you will ask a friend to do. The trouble of relying on markets, such as to hire someone, you need a labor market for miscellaneous friend tasks. So in economic jargon, it is a transaction cost, right? Relying on markets has a transaction cost. Social infrastructure reduces transaction costs. Metaphorically, social infrastructure is the grease that reduces the friction of human interactions and allows the machinery of social society to function. So you're not always having relations and friendships just to save money. It's part of the way we live and function. For example, if I want to buy a new phone, I would just ask friends what they have bought and whether they are happy with it, and so on. So there is information being provided which will help me to do my thing, but that's not the main purpose of the relation that you are talking about. Further, building trust either via friendships or professional relationships is extremely time intensive, i.e. requires significant investment, and these always get strained when some external and exogenous factors play in. For example, if you disagree on the political ideologies with each other, or a new leader comes in and begins to expose the differences in your thought process, whether you agree with the leader or not, and so on and so forth, right? So these are extremely time intensive and require significant investments. Thus, because social structure produces benefits and requires investments, it is infrastructure. Of course, human systems are a bit more complicated because you are making many compromises. It's not like a road is a road is a road. You have friendships where you disagree, but the overall benefit is much higher than any cost involved in the disagreements and so on. As mentioned above, to produce valuable outputs, multiple types of infrastructure must be combined. In fact, we argue that all types are necessary with the exception of social infrastructure in some very special cases. We'll explore this point more as we go on, but first we consider the connection between collective action and infrastructure so that we can come back to common goods, which is our main topic here. So moving on then to collective action and infrastructure. In the system's perspective, there are a number of collective action problems related to the creation, maintenance, and use of infrastructure. One key problem is the question of who is going to pay for the creation of the infrastructure, or, put another way, how will the cost be shared? Farmers in rural Nepal may pay by providing labor to the construction and maintenance of the irrigation system, as we discussed before. In many Western societies, we have governments that collect taxes and use the resulting revenue to pay for the creation of infrastructure. But as you know, paying taxes is not a very easy thing for humans to do. But demanding infrastructure and services is very, a birthright that we expect government to do certain things and so on. The regulations regarding who pays can lead to perverse effects. For example, in the US, the federal government pitches in to pay the majority of the costs for highways, while the local governments pay less than half the costs. As a consequence, local governments are often eager to increase the number of highways to promote economic development, so they directly benefit from the federal investment. The subsidizing of road expansion was instituted after World War II to stimulate road expansion to improve transportation and accessibility, and indirectly economic development. Such infrastructures always help businesses, firms, individuals, and actions in these action situations that are being mentioned here. A consequence of this policy is that roads are cheap for users, and this enhances the demand for using them because it's can be made available. Why not? One reason for the low price for using roads is the relative lack of maintenance, which is paid for by local governments. So you can imagine the federal government gives you a highway, but your piece of the highway is your problem in terms of maintenance. So local governments want to improve economic performance to send signals to voters to get re-elected, but forget that roads must be maintained. This activity may generate short-term benefits, but generates a long-term burden for taxpayers, because you may want more and more roads, but then the cost of maintaining them keeps adding up. One way to generate more funds for road maintenance is through the users pay principle and to raise taxes on gasoline, an indirect way to charge drivers to use the roads. Of course, this is a politically challenging proposition for elected officials who cannot afford to be seen as raising taxes. And there are inequities involved in there as well, because if you raise gasoline taxes, then poor people who have to go to work, and because of lack of public transportation they may have to drive, then they get penalized for this road requirement, let's say for the rich who want to drive around for vacation, etc. Right? So there are always details we have to worry about. The second collective action problem for infrastructure is to define who gets access to its use. In many irrigation systems, for example, there is a natural asymmetry between the upstream and downstream users of the canal system that we talked about. If the rules are that upstream people can use all the water they want, then the downstream people can get the pollution and less water. Farmers have to solve the collective action problem of how to deal with this asymmetry. They may create a rotation system to reduce the impact of asymmetry, so that there are sharing agreements on equal access to the upstream and downstream users. When taxpayers contribute equally to the creation of infrastructure, this does not mean that they all have access. Taxpayers contribute to higher education, but not everyone who pays taxes has access to the knowledge infrastructure that is created. Right? Think about it. Operational costs for universities are paid even when it's a private university. There is some support from the states, Just the relative amount raised depends on whether it's a private or a government institution, but that doesn't mean you can walk into these institutions and seek free education. There are criteria for students to be admitted. For example, the reason that societies invest in higher education is that everyone benefits indirectly. So if they have educated people, they create economic activities that benefit everybody else, and this is indirect by having a highly educated population such as physicians, engineers, and lawyers. We have economic activities that benefit everybody even though they did not access the education system directly. Okay, so let's come back and look at the institutional analysis and development framework that we looked at before in figure 2.5 of chapter 2, and then we will look at an application of it, and then we'll move to coupled infrastructure systems to do this analysis with some additional information needed in the systems perspective. Okay, so see you in the next podcast.